Dr. Will's History Road Trip. Tonight we're going to do another series in our U.S. presidential elections. This one's entitled The Cross of Gold, and it's about the presidential election of 1896. This was a very important and consequential election in U.S. history. The impact of decisions made during this election cycle can be felt down to the present day. Now, many of the elections we've already talked about have featured third parties, and this one will too, but not in a way that you would more than likely expect. Another thing that distinguishes the 1896 election is that this is the only presidential election I can think of where monetary policy was the foremost issue. Normally, that kind of thing takes a back seat to more emotional hot-button issues. Even today, if you start talking monetary policy, you're going to see people's eyes glaze over in seconds. However, during the 1890s, monetary policy was the hot-button emotional issue, as we're going to see. Before we get started, just like to add, if you like what I'm doing, please subscribe to the channel. Please smash that like button on your screen. That helps me with the YouTube's algorithms and whatnot. And you'll also get notified when I put out new content. Also, please consider supporting the channel. Your support will improve the quality of these videos and of the content, the variety of on-location videos I'm able to do. My PayPal and other info can be found in the description box of this video. Also, a brief bibliography of the content in this video can be found in the description box as well. Now, in order to understand what happens in 1896 in that election, we need to do a little background info first. Why was monetary policy such a big issue? Well, it first became an issue with American farmers. Now, what happened during the period of the 1870s to the 1890s was a decline in agriculture. This was the first time in U.S. history that we began to hear about the quote-unquote farm problem. And it can be a little perplexing if you look at the numbers on the surface. If you go look at the censuses in 1870 and 1880, 1890 was mostly destroyed with the fire, so you can't look at that. But if you look at those two censuses, and if you look at county-level tax rolls in different states, you'll see that there were more farms during this period than there had ever been before. There were more farmers. They were producing more, and what they produced was worth more. So how is agriculture in the decline? The problem is that relative to other ways of making a living, agriculture was not keeping up. Every other way of making a living during the Gilded Age was improving: manufacturing, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. What happened with farmers is that they found themselves in a position where they suffered for low prices for what they produced and high costs for what they had to buy. And they went into a lot of debt. A lot of them suffered foreclosures. A lot of farmers were in serious trouble during this period. Now, why is that the case? Well, the fundamental problem then was overproduction. When farmers overproduce, the price goes down. That's wonderful for the consumer, bad deal for the producer. And that's simple supply and demand. You've got more supply, not as much demand, price is going to go down. The problem with farming is that a farmer can't overprice. Other ways of making a living, you can price your items a little higher and try to recover some money. You can only do that so long. Farmer can't overprice. What distinguishes your tomatoes from the guy one farm over? If you raise the price on your tomatoes, nobody will buy yours, they'll buy his. Can a farmer cut back on costs? Now really, what you going to use? Use cheaper dirt? It doesn't work that way. Your primary resource is your land. You're also going to pay taxes on that land whether you work it or not. Also, you're going to pay for the equipment that you had to buy whether you work the land or not. So all these things are a problem. Also, can you predict how much crop you're going to reap at the end of the season? You can't. So you have to work like crazy and produce a lot. Producing a lot is normally a good thing, but if you overproduce, it drives the price down. Okay. Now, farmers aren't going to blame overproduction for their problems. They're mostly going to blame transportation costs and the monetary system. Now, from the 1870s to the 1890s, the U.S. economy was in a period of deflation, falling prices. Now, today we don't see deflation as a problem at all. We're worried about inflation. How in the world can falling prices be a problem? Well, look at it this way. Falling prices are really good for creditors, people who loan money. and they're good for consumers. Going back to creditors, let's say you loan somebody $1 when wheat cost $1 a bushel, and that dollar is to be paid back in 2 years. And let's say at the end of that 2 years, the price of wheat has fallen to 50 cents a bushel. Now, how many bushels of wheat do you have to produce to pay back that dollar you borrowed? You gotta produce 2, right? It just doubled. So in other words, if you're the creditor, if you loaned out that dollar and now you're getting 2 bushels of wheat in return, that's a good deal for you. But for the farmer, he's got to work twice as hard. That's tough. Deflation is not good for the debtor, and it's not good. It wasn't good for producers. Okay. The next logical question we have to ask is this: why were prices dropping? Prices were dropping during this period, 1870s to 1890s, because there was a shortage of the money supply in the United States. There just wasn't enough money in the economy. While everything else in the country was growing, population, industry, etc., money supply is not keeping up. Well, with a shortage of money, prices are dropping. Okay. Why is the money supply inadequate? Well, in 1879, the United States went on something called the de facto gold standard. Now, when I say de facto, that means that Congress didn't pass a law that said we're going to be on the gold standard. The Treasury Department just did it. It's just a fact, not by law, which would be de jure. So what happened at that point is that starting in 1879, anything the United States called a dollar was equal to a certain amount of gold and was redeemable in a certain amount of weight in gold. Now, we can't do this now because we're not on the gold standard, but back in those days, you could go to the U.S. Treasury and you could exchange your actual bill, your note, for gold, okay? They didn't have as much faith in their notes as we do in our legal tender today. Pull out a dollar bill sometime and take a look at it. You know what backs up your money today? The full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Just think about that, let it sink in, take from that whatever you will. All right, well, in 1879, then, we're on the de facto gold standard. And at that point, we maintained a gold reserve worth $100 million in gold. That's how much gold we had in reserve. And we stood ready to redeem any currency obligation of the United States in gold. Now, if that's what we're doing, what determines how much money we have in circulation? Well, the amount of gold we have. And the problem is there just wasn't a whole lot of gold being produced in the United States at that time. So the money system was limited in the way it's set up. Now, if you're a farmer and you're in debt and you're having a hard time getting out of debt because prices are falling and you can't get high prices for the things you're producing, deflation is bad for you. What do you need? Well, if you're a farmer in this system, you need inflation, especially if you're in debt. How are you going to get it? Well, you need more money. How are you going to get that? Some people said that what we ought to do is just print up greenbacks, just print money. And we'd done that during the Civil War. Of course, what that's going to do is to lower the purchasing power of the dollar, so that's not realistically considered, although in the late 1870s, you did have a political party come out called the Greenback Labor Party, and that's the chief thing they advocated. They weren't around for very long. Well, that's probably not going to be seriously considered. But is there any other precious metal out there we could use besides gold? How about silver? In the beginning of this country's history, we had used both silver and gold as the basis of money, but we had quit using silver some time ago before this. Well, what the farmers said we needed to do is go back to using silver. We had found huge silver deposits in the 1850s and the 60s out west, if you've ever heard of the Comstock Lode in Nevada. And that was a huge silver deposit. And of course, our next door neighbors to the south, Mexico, were and still are the world's leading producer of silver. So we can get our hands on silver. So farmers start to agitate and say that the U.S. government needs to get as much silver as they can get their hands on, coin it, and turn it into money. And they had a term for that. The term was free silver. Now, that didn't mean they're going to hand out silver for free. It means free and unlimited coinage of silver as currency. All the silver people wanted to turn into money could be turned into money. That's what they meant, okay? And there was actually a ratio at the time of how much silver was worth as compared to gold. I think 16 grains of silver was worth 1 grain of gold, is the way that worked. Now, farmers and debtors screamed for free silver so loudly that Congress finally responded. They responded in 1890 by passing a law called the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. This act required the U.S. government to buy up a whole bunch of silver every month and turn it into money. Silver dollars, silver certificates, you name it. Now, ostensibly, what that should have done is brought more money and inflation and raised prices. And it passed. It was passed. It was signed into law by the president at the time, Benjamin Harrison. But even though it passed, it didn't bring inflation. It didn't raise prices. Why? Because the Treasury is still ready to redeem every one of those silver dollars with gold. They tied the price of silver to the price of gold. Remember, 16 grains of silver was equal to 1 grain of gold, which means if you tie the amount of silver in the system to the amount of gold you've got, the amount of gold is still what determines how much money you have in the system. So this will not work. It won't end the period of deflation. So the bottom line here is that farmers during this period are in serious trouble, primarily due to overproduction, but there's also other problems. And they start to think that what the government ought to do is help them out. And that's not going to happen during this period, at least not at first. Both major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, during the late 19th century believed in laissez-faire politics. That meant that the government should do very little to regulate the economy. Now, the Republicans weren't completely laissez-faire during this period. The Republicans believed in a high protective tariff. At this period in history, the Republican stronghold was the North and a lot of the Northeast. And they wanted high tariffs to keep out foreign industrial goods so people would buy industrial goods from the Northeast. So they've got that, but other than the protective tariff, they're pretty laissez-faire. The Democrats were truly laissez-faire during this era. They were a free trade party. They decried government interference in all forms. So what happens is the farmers start to protest. They found that they couldn't get anywhere unorganized, and they realized they were going to have to try and do something about their problem. So they started to organize, and they formed farmers' organizations. The first one was called the Grange. That went all the way back to 1867, and that started sort of as a social institution. It was sort of like a farm fraternity. But by the 1870s, it got turned into a political organization. They had around 1.5 million members. And they got involved in politics. They tried to sway state governments to help out and operated at that level. Eventually, that doesn't work out for them. They're going to fade away in the 1880s. And then they're going to be replaced in the 1880s by several groups called the Farmers' Alliances. Now, technically, there were 3 of them. We're not going to get into all the details. But the largest Farmers' Alliance was the Southern Farmers' Alliance, which was based in Texas. Actually, was founded in 1876 in Lampasas, Texas. And by the way, they're real proud of that in Lampasas. If you ever drive up Highway 281 through Lampasas, there's a historical marker on each end of town that tells you about the Farmers' Alliance. By the 1890s, the Farmers Alliance had somewhere near 5 million members. And they started off also as sort of an economic organization. They promoted things like co-ops and that kind of thing. But they eventually took their complaints into politics. And they took their complaints to the national level, which the Grange had not done. And then they got into politics. But politics at the national level during the late 1880s, early 1890s, was ruled by laissez-faire attitudes. So you've got a large group of people in this country, mostly farmers. They're organized. They can't get either major party to listen to them. So what do they decide to do? Well, they form a third party. And that's how these farmers' alliances kind of morphed into a political third party movement called the Populist Party. Between 1890 and 1892, farmers are going to enter politics as the Populist Party. Technically, it was called the People's Party. Everybody referred to him as the Populist. The basic point of the People's Party or the Populist Party was, we farmers are in trouble, we're hurting, neither party is going to help us. So they go into politics as a protest. Now, the Populist Party entered its first presidential election in 1892, and they held their convention in Omaha, Nebraska. They chose presidential candidates. Their presidential candidate, the Populist in 1892, was a man named James Weaver, who had been a Union general during the Civil War. He was from somewhere in the Midwest. And then James Field, for vice president, Field had been a Confederate general during the Civil War, and he was from Virginia. And you can see what the Populists are trying to do here. A couple of things. They're appealing to the South and to the West, the agricultural regions of the country. They're also, politics during the Gilded Age was a lot of blaming each other for, mostly it's the Republicans blaming the Democrats for the Civil War. And what the Populists are saying here by nominating a former Union general and then a former Confederate general as his running mate was enough of that business. We got more important things to deal with, okay? Now, the most important thing that the Populists did in their convention in Omaha was to draw up a platform. They wrote a political platform, and you know what a platform is. It's basically a statement of party beliefs. And this one was called the Omaha Platform because the convention was in Omaha. And I'm going to give you a list of some things they called for in the Omaha Platform. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is the most important things. One of the things they called for was a flexible national currency issued by the national government. A flexible national currency issued by the national government. What do they mean by flexible? Well, what they meant is more money to result in inflation. How are you going to get that flexible currency? Well, one idea they had was something called the sub-treasury system. And what the sub-treasury system, well, this actually was an idea that came out of the Farmers Alliance in Texas. It had been promoted by the president of the Texas Farmers Alliance, a man named Charles McCune. But the sub-treasury system, the idea was that the government, the federal government, will build sub-treasuries or little warehouses all around the country. And then farmers could bring their non-perishable crops, so cotton, wheat, things like that, and store them in these sub-treasuries. Then they would receive a loan against the value of the crop they were storing. Where are you going to get money to loan these farmers money? Well, you just print it out, legal tender, okay? That was the idea. It was not exchangeable for gold. Now, the idea behind this was that you leave these crops in the sub-treasury until the price of these crops start. In other words, when the supply goes down, then and the price goes up, then you sell these crops on the market, and then you would pay back the government for that loan you got in legal tender. That was the idea, okay? In the meantime, there would be money in circulation. The idea is that this would help farmers with overproduction, and they'd also be able to keep crops off the market. There's a big flaw in this. I mean, what happens if everybody keeps their crops off the market and then all of a sudden they sell them all at once when the price goes up? Well, then the price goes right back down. I don't know if they thought about that. So that's one way they had of a flexible national currency, legal tender through a sub-treasury system. Second way was through free silver. Free and unlimited coining of silver as money. Now, we had the Sherman Silver Purchase Act by this point, but the Populists argued that's not enough. We're not coining enough silver. There needs to be more, and it doesn't need to be tied to the amount of gold in the reserve, okay? Now, think about that. What the Populists are calling for here is radically different from the two major parties. Does this stuff sound like laissez-faire to you, the government staying out of the economics? It's the opposite of laissez-faire. This was the government heavily involved in economics, okay? So that's one thing, part of the Omaha Platform, flexible national currency. Second thing they wanted, progressive income tax, which is what we have today. The more money you make, the more you pay. Third thing they called for, direct election of senators. Up to this point in our history, according to the original Constitution, senators were not elected directly by the people. They were elected by state legislators. Well, the Populists argued that the state legislatures were too controlled by special interest, and in order to take the special interest out of it, you needed to let the people vote directly for senators. Because if you let the people vote directly, there's no way special interest can get involved, right? And we see how that works out. I think they're going to be involved, find a way to get involved any way you look at it. Okay, but that's what they wanted. They believed that if the senators were directly elected by the people, there would be less corruption. And then finally, number four, the fourth big thing they want. The Populists called for the U.S. government to own and operate all railroads and telegraph systems in the United States. Listen to what I just said. I didn't say regulate. They wanted the federal government to own the railroad and telegraph systems. Now we're talking radical. Okay, that's essentially a socialistic reform, isn't it? When you've got the government owning businesses in competition, well, actually, it wouldn't even be in competition. And what the populists are calling for is the government to own it. And their idea was that these things were so important to the whole country that the country itself should control it. Okay? So what the populists are calling for are reforms. Some of them are liberal reforms. Some of them, like the government controlling the telegraph and railroad systems, are radical. Okay? But the most important thing is that what the populists are doing right here is rejecting laissez-faire. Okay? They're rejecting laissez-faire completely. And not only did they completely reject laissez-faire and have some planks of the platform that were radical, their leaders used some pretty frightening and radical language. There was one guy that ran for governor in Colorado as a populist named Davis Wade. And let me just read you a quote from Davis Wade. He said, quote, "Before the country continues the way it's going, it is infinitely better that blood should flow to our horses' bridles than our national liberty should be destroyed," end quote. He's talking about blood flowing to the horses' bridles. I mean, he's talking about wading chest deep in blood. That's pretty strong language, right? He got the nickname Bloody Bridles Wait because of that. There were even some female speakers who were just as radical. One of the most important was a lady named Mary Lease from Kansas. And Mary Lease went around making speeches for the Populists. Let me just read you some quotes from Mary Lease. And these will sound familiar to rhetoric you've heard in the last 10 years in this country. Quote, "Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people or by the people and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. The great common people of this country are slaves and monopolies are the masters. We will stand by our homes and stay by our firesides by force. If necessary, we will not pay our debts to the loan shark companies until the government pays its debt to us. The people are at bay. Let the bloodhounds of money who have dogged us beware." That's pretty strong language, isn't it? Okay. Does that not sound a lot like the Occupy Wall Street movement of about 10 years ago, 2011, 2012? To me, that's what it sounds like. She also told farmers that what they needed to do was raise less corn and raise more hell. And what she's trying to do is get people's attention. Now, it's going to be under these circumstances that the next presidential election occurs there in 1892. The Republicans nominated the incumbent, Benjamin Harrison. The Democrats nominated Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland had been the president between 1885 and 1889. He won the popular vote in 1888, but lost the Electoral College vote to Harrison, so he was out for 4 years. Democrats come back with him. And Cleveland's going to win this election. Now, the Populists do pretty well. Out of 12 million votes cast, they got 1 million. That's not bad for a third party in their first election. They actually carried electoral votes in 4 states. Kansas was one, Colorado was one. They got 22 electoral votes. But if you look at the map here, the Populists had some real problems going forward. One of their main problems is they had no appeal in the Northeast. None. Now, they tried to. They tried to appeal to industrial workers in the Northeast and said, we stand for the working man. But here's the problem. The Populists, what's their main goal? What do they want for the farmers? They want inflation. Okay? If you're a Pittsburgh steel worker and you have to buy your food, do you want inflation? No, you don't want prices on food to go up. You're happy with deflation. So they're never going to appeal to the industrial Northeast. Okay? Now, you'd think they might have a chance to appeal to the South. The South is an agricultural region as well. But in the South, the problem they had was a race issue. Populists in the South tried to appeal to black voters as well as whites. There's a famous populist speaker that went around giving speeches, and he'd say things like, you know, if you're in a ditch with a man, you're not worried about the color of his skin, you're trying to help each other get out the ditch. Now, a lot of conservative Democrats in the South aren't going to like that in the 1890s. And they definitely don't want the populists to have any power. Remember, Democrats had only in the last 15 or 16 years taken back power from Southern Republicans. They don't want their votes to be split. They don't want the chance of another party coming along and taking power away from them. So they would use racism and say things like, you know, don't vote for the Populist. The Populist is a black man's party. Basically tried to paint him as the new version of the Republican Party. Okay. Now, this populist revolt is going to come to a head in the presidential election of 1896. That'd be the most important election in this country since 1876. But before we get to that, you got to understand what happens to Grover Cleveland during this period as president. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Dr. Will's History Road Trip. If you like what I'm doing and want to continue following, please subscribe to my channel and click the notification button so you'll get updates when I post new content. Also, please consider supporting me via PayPal, Venmo, or CashApp. Your support will enable me to go to interesting places and film them and talk about them with you. Feel free to suggest locations that you might like to see me visit in the comments below. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the road.